government should increase its diplomatic efforts to peacefully resolve internal armed conflicts in West Asia for two key reasons, with our first contention being mediation, subpoint A, Libya. As the Congressional Research Service reports, Libya has been unable to form a stable government, address security issues, or finance the country, allowing for persistent lawlessness that enables militias, criminals, and Islamic terrorist groups to endanger civilians' rights and safety. Furthermore, there are constant internal armed conflicts according to the Center for Foreign Relations. However, through increased diplomatic efforts, these internal armed conflicts can be resolved. As the Chatham House explained, negotiations took place between March and June to 2022 in order to move Libya towards stability. Negotiators reached agreement on important issues that had never been discussed, and the only reason these negotiations fell through was because of a miscommunication between the international mediator and the parties in determining a new location. As the U.S. Institute of Peace points out, the U.S. can engage international actors to help incentivize Libyan political leaders to come back to the table. However, the ceasefire from 2020 continues to stay in place, leading to lives saved. Furthermore, the Brookings Institute reports that it is unlikely that fighting will return to the drastic levels from before. Subpoint B, Yemen. As the Council on Foreign Relations summarizes, this conflict in Yemen is between the internationally recognized government, backed by a Saudi-led military coalition, and Houthi rebels supported by Iran. The humanitarian crisis has displaced more than 4 million people and given rise to cholera outbreak, medicine shortages, and threats of famine. However, there is potential for a peaceful resolution. As Foreign Affairs reports, both parties agreed to a UN truce that significantly stopped the fighting between the groups. The UN reported that casualties across the country dropped 60%. Furthermore, even after Yemen's truce expired, key agreements of the truce continued. As the U.S. Special Envoy for Yemen reported, the free flow of fuel into the Hodeidah port continued, regular commercial flights to and from Sana's airport continued that allowed 27,000 Yemenis to get medical treatment, and a reduction in civilian casualties continued due to a dramatic reduction in hostilities. Not only did civilian casualties decrease, but negotiations on a broader truce agreement continued between the parties even after the truce ended. Overall, the U.S. has needed to mediate and bring both groups back to the table. As Alexandra Stark, a senior researcher on the Middle East, pointed out, increased U.S. diplomatic engagement has led to international players to increase their support for the current UN ceasefire. Furthermore, as Foreign Affairs reports, U.S. diplomacy opens doors for future mediations and discussions in Yemen. The impact of this is peace. With millions displaced and thousands dead, stability in the Middle East is integral, and by mediating these conflicts, peace can finally be achieved for these war-torn countries. Contention 2, drugs. Increasing diplomatic efforts in West Asian countries, like Iran, opens up opportunities to create interventionist drug policies throughout neighboring countries. In the Middle East, drug production and trafficking has long funded violent conflict. In Lebanon, for example, Hezbollah and various sectarian militias profit from these drugs beginning in the 1970s. The impact of this is that under an AF ballot, drug trafficking is reduced. Increased diplomatic efforts in Iran opens the door for Iran to increase regulation on drug trafficking. The U.S. can do this through 3 ways, according to the Washington Institute. First, put pressure on Iranian forces to cooperate with regional forces to refocus on drug smuggling. 2, direct aid to addressing socioeconomic factors and poverty hotspots. And 3, providing equipment for border control of drug smuggling. And for all these reasons, Judge, my partner and I urge a strong AF ballot. Thank you. Judges, are we allowed to do thank yous? Is that okay? Okay. So really quickly, I just wanted to say thank you to our amazing coaches, our team, PF, LD, World School Congress. You guys have all been absolutely phenomenal. We would not be here in this position without all of you guys. So thank you, because this is not just us, this is you here with us. Secondly, I'd like to thank our alums, Sydney, Nate, Annika, Hattie, Greta, too. Like, you guys all have been instrumental, again, in getting us here as well. You guys came back just to help us, which is, like, the sweetest thing ever. Third, I want to thank Xander, because ever since we partnered up, I think clearly it's been a beneficial partnership. And I'm really, really thankful that we've been able to get to work together these past couple of years, become friends, and honestly, I think this is a great way to end our season.
I'd like to thank my parents because I wouldn't be here without them, but also they've encouraged me to do debate. They actually forced me into it, and I wouldn't be here standing in front of all of you if it weren't for them. And finally, I would like to thank all of you judges for taking the time out of your day to actually come and judge and sit through a 45-minute debate round and probably multiple others too. So, thank you. Okay, and with that said, is anybody not ready? Throughout West Asia, U.S. strategic interest and bias continues to fuel armed conflicts rather than resolve them. The Middle East Institute of Peace this year explains when the U.S. seeks to use diplomacy, it fails to balance its diplomatic goals with its militaristic power. Moreover, the Middle East is too divided for U.S. concessions to facilitate peace. Internal armed conflicts are fueled by proxies and terrorism, which diplomacy cannot solve on its own. Thus, Zaner and I negate the resolution the United States federal government should increase its diplomatic efforts to peacefully resolve internal armed conflicts in West Asia. We will have two contentions to support our stance. Contention 1, a pro-world would result in detrimental trade-offs. Responsible Statecraft from last year states that U.S. diplomatic institutions lack resources. Because of this, failures in U.S. diplomacy lead to more military involvement. The U.S. is currently allocating its limited diplomatic and military resources in the right places. Shifting them to West Asia, especially with the lofty goal of creating peace, would indefinitely require the U.S. to decrease its presence in other regions. As the War in the Rocks in 2022 explains, what the U.S. does in one region impinges on its ability to resource deterrence in another region. Foreign Policy in 2023 points out that the U.S. is already trying to combat two major powers at the same time: Russia with its war in Ukraine, and China with its increasing influence in the Indo-Pacific. Looking to Ukraine first, Bloomberg of this month explains that Ukraine will be ready for diplomatic talks with Russia soon, and the U.S. will need to focus its diplomatic efforts there. On top of this, New York Times in 2023 explains that stockpiles in the U.S. are strained, and American arm makers cannot keep up, forcing the U.S. to pull from Israeli arms reserves in order to keep up Ukrainian support. Clearly, the U.S. is already spread way too thin. The Congressional Research Center of last year finds that the Russia-Ukraine war and its side effects actually amplify the risk of instability in West Asia. Working to first peacefully resolve the war in Ukraine is necessary to stabilize West Asia. Moving to the Indo-Pacific, the U.S. National Defense Strategy in 2022 explains that China is the U.S.'s largest threat. As China has become more aggressive towards Taiwan and poses threats to India, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, U.S. commitments in the region are paramount. The Middle East Institute of this year states that China is limited in what it can accomplish in West Asia due to U.S.-caused obstacles in its own backyard. With China focused on its neighboring countries, the U.S. must continue its competition in the Indo-Pacific rather than West Asia. An increase in U.S. diplomacy in West Asia will take away from key U.S. commitments in heavily important regions such as Ukraine and the Indo-Pacific. Contention 2, the pro-world aids terrorists. The resolution requires the U.S. to increase its diplomatic engagement within the armed conflicts of West Asia. The problem, however, is that nearly all of these internal armed conflicts involve terrorist groups as one of the primary belligerents. In Iraq and Syria, there's ISIS. In Turkey, the Kurds. In Yemen, the Iranian-backed Houthis. In Lebanon, the Iranian-backed Hezbollah. Diplomatic engagement with these groups would be a tragic mistake for three reasons. First, it would elevate the terrorist group in stature and force the U.S. to offer concessions to groups who have sought the nation's downfall. Second, diplomacy necessitates a ceasefire, enabling these terrorist groups to go and rest and regroup. This effect is particularly dangerous with ISIS. The Department of Defense just recently agreed to a 4-year partnership to militarily defeat the Islamic State. The pro-world would have us immediately cease this action. This would be a grave mistake, as the Institute of Peace of last year tells us that military efforts have downgraded the threat that ISIS posed. The Congressional Research Service in 2022 explains that one of the key functions that the U.S. provides is limiting ISIS's access to global financial institutions. ISIS's spokesman would almost assuredly ask for this practice to end in exchange for sitting down for a round or two of diplomacy that's likely to go nowhere. The bottom line is that negotiating with terrorists and rogue states has never benefited the U.S., and there is no reason to start now. Finally, the simple act of proposing a diplomatic solution to our partner nations would alienate them at the exact same time that we need them most. According to the Wilson Center of last year, Turkey believes that the PKK are a major threat. By trying to appease the enemies of our allies believe we are betraying them. To protect the fragile balance of diplomacy and military power, we strongly urge you to vote nay. Ready for process?
We are going to be taking running time. Time's ready now.
first speaker, can I have the first question?
Of course, judges, are you all ready?
So in terms of the Chinese involvement with Russia and Ukraine, what indication is there that we want to get involved in this conflict?
In Russia and Ukraine, are you asking why is the U.S. and Russia and Ukraine?
Why does the U.S. want to get involved?
First off, the U.S. is already involved. I mean, it's all over the news. But basically what we see is Ukraine and Russia have kind of been in conflict for a while now. And so Russia's been trying to invade Ukraine and essentially increase their influence in the region. So what Russia and China essentially want is influence.
And how exactly does China tie into this?
Yeah, we're saying they're kind of two different points. So first off, you have Ukraine as one, war that the U.S. is already involved in, but you also have the Indo-Pacific.
So why would the U.S. want to get involved with China then?
Okay, so first off, again, we are allies with Taiwan, which is one of the main issues in this actually war. So China's trying to increase their influence in the Indo-Pacific as well. They're going into the region and trying to take over Taiwan and a lot of those allies in the region as well.
Okay, you can have a question.
Great, okay, so in your second contention, you talk about these, Iran can increase their drug policies basically by doing negotiations with Iran for better
Yes.
drug policies there.
Yes.
Okay, so if Iran is funding these proxy groups who are involved in these internal armed conflicts, why would they want to better drug policies that deter these proxy groups?
So what's important to note with this situation is in Iran, there are major terrorist groups taking away from government funding that could be funneled into the government. So when it comes to increasing diplomatic efforts, if we are to engage ourselves more with governmental actors within this region, we can influence them to create interventionist drug policies that would actually benefit Iran's government, if I can finish, because we are going to be allowing them to funnel money that would be going to terrorist groups such as Hezbollah actually into the Iranian government.
Can I have a follow-up question?
Sure.
Okay, so as I said though, Iran is funding it. Like they want
Yes.
to fund these groups though.
Yes,
They have
but
those
as
groups
we
too.
can see, there are different terrorist groups that they are funding. Specifically with Hezbollah, they are actually taking away money from Iran. So because this is a terrorist group taking away money from a governmental actor, we can see that of course they are going to want more funding for the Iranian government because with increased diplomacy, we are directly providing solvency that would provide more money going into the Iranian government.
Okay.
So in terms of diplomacy, so why would diplomacy why is diplomacy not military fueling terrorism? Not militarization. Why is diplomacy fueling terrorism?
Yeah, okay. So basically our second contention is talking about the fact that one, you can look to empirics. The United States has never done diplomacy with a terrorist organization and seen benefits from it.
Yeah.
So if you sit down with like the Houthis or if you sit down with Hezbollah or any of the, or even ISIS, what they're going to do is chip away at every ounce of U.S. leverage that we have, right? The only way they're going to come to a compromise is if the U.S. takes off some militaristic aspect that they have on them.
Right, right.
So essentially what we're going to do is have to take away our military so that they're, they gain
So how is
leverage in the
diplomacy
region.
fueling terrorism, not militarization?
We're saying by taking away the U.S. military from the region, by
Okay.
giving into what they want.
So it's the
we're
militarization, not the diplomacy. And that's time.
Okay, I'm going to be taking running prep time. Time starting now. Okay, time 57 seconds. Okay, judges ready? Yep. Opponents ready? Partner ready? Quick off-time roadmap. I'm going to go through framework and then just their case and the strengthening our case. Time starting now. First of all, thousands of miles away, we have children, families, and people suffering. Because we stand with lives today we affirm. Let's start with the framework. If the affirmation proves that we save any amount of lives compared to the status quo where nothing is being done, we win the ballot today. Now moving on to their first contention, I have 4 responses. First of all, let's take a look at Larison 22 that says the reason diplomacy is impaired is because of a lack of resources. We agree with the negation on that. However, when you increase diplomacy, you also increase the amount of diplomatic resources. Lack of resources is why the shift in regions has to occur. But if you have enough resources, you don't have a shift. So it is possible to concentrate on both regions with an AF ballot. Number 2, we also tell you that in Russia and Ukraine, we don't use diplomacy against Russia, so you're not moving any of the resources. Number 3, we also tell you that Applebaum 22 at the Atlantic reports that after specifically diplomacy is not being used in Russia, Applebaum 22 tells you that Russia only respects hard power. So we're not using diplomacy with Russia anyway, so there won't be a diversion of resources. But number 4, even if you don't believe this, they keep telling you that the United States is involved in Russia and Ukraine and China. However, when we take a look at the U.S. involvement in Russia, the U.S. has specifically not intervened in Ukraine and Russia and has not given any military aid. So currently we see that the U.S. has really no interest in intervening in Russia and Ukraine. Therefore, for all these reasons, when we take a look at the actual linking, we actually see, first of all, it might not be even diplomacy that's being used against Russia, and we actually won't have a diversion of resources because under the AF ballot, you're increasing diplomatic intervention, which means you're also increasing diplomatic resources. But now moving on to their second contention, I have 3 responses to it. First of all, you outweigh us on impacts, because even if we make concessions to terrorists, again, we tell you at the beginning, there's millions of people suffering due to the status quo in the negation world. Right now, even if we help a little bit of people compared to the status quo, we still outweigh on impact. So yes, we agree that there's concessions to some terrorist groups, but we still see an impact of stability and peace, and therefore that impact outweighs on the app. Number 2, they also tell you that having truces and ceasefires and diplomacy allows the Houthis or any other rebel groups to recuperate. What they fail to tell you is specifically that Johnson 22 that explains that the truce actually helped the government true and was an opportune time for the official government to recuperate too. So when you're weighing on impacts again, yes, the Houthis were able to recuperate, but also the government officials and the government forces were able to recuperate too. So when you're weighing on impact, they go null for both sides. My third and final impact is specifically to their military, to their linking. They keep giving example. They keep saying that this diplomacy aids terrorism. The examples they've given and their cards that they've given is specifically military involvement. So when we take a look at diplomacy is not military involvement. My fourth and final response is that military involvement actually doesn't combat terrorism in the first place. When we take a look at Thrall 18 from the Cato Institute, it reports that there's little evidence from the past 16 years that direct military intervention is the right way to combat terrorism. Again, showing you in the status quo, we need change, and that change is diplomacy. Now moving on to strengthening our case. If we take a Libya contention 1A, Williams 23 at the Brookings Institute said the ceasefire continued, and he said even if the ceasefire were to fall apart, you would still see a decrease in violence. Yemen, contention 1B. Lender King 22 said the key agreements of the truce still continued even after the truce fell apart. So you see long-term and short-term impacts on both of these. Contention 2 on drugs, we tell you that Thelwell Brown says that drug trafficking directly funds terrorism. And by reducing the amount of drug trafficking, we also reduce the impact terrorism has and therefore saves lives. Affirmative, all we have to prove to you today is that we're saving lives, and we've clearly done that. Urge half.
Really quickly, Sonia kind of already went over everything, so I don't want to take too long to go over this. But again, thank you to the team, especially the public forum novices and the other debaters that we've been working with. Thank you guys so much. The LD team, World School Policy, you guys have been really amazing throughout the entirety of this season, and it's been a really cool team to work with for our senior year. So I'm really thankful for all of you guys. And then Sonia, of course, been a great partner. I'm really happy that we came here, and really happy that we're in this final round right now. And then to Sydney, Annika, my sister, and other alumni that have helped us recently. Also, Nathan, thank you guys so much for your help in this round and in other rounds. You guys have been really great, and I appreciate you guys so much. And then, of course, our coaches, our speech coach, who isn't here, and usually is, but he wasn't able to be here, Mr. McCoy, thank you so much. Lowry, Mr. Coots, Taylor, thank you all. And then, of course, have to thank my parents for me being here. So, also, thank you to all the judges. Thank you guys so much. So, all right. Quick off-time roadmap. I'm just going to do an observation of the round and then put down their case and go back and defend our arguments. Anyone not ready? Time starts. Our opponents are going to try to make diplomacy seem as though it's this magical tool that will inherently solve for every single problem in West Asia. However, this has never happened, and as we tell you in our case, the U.S. has been trying to do diplomacy and military and all kinds of different things within the Middle East for centuries, and we've never seen peace in the region. This is clear that empirically we do not see peace come to fruition, and this is not going to change under the resolution. Let's get into their first contention where they talk about Libya. First off, they talk about how you have to have a stable government. My first attack here is it's simply impossible to have a stable government in Libya. According to the Handbook of Revolutions in the 21st Century in 2022, they point out that the current actors within Libya are Russia and Turkey that are trying to influence by backing different sides and helping to prolong the civil war there, as well as you have Russia, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE are backing the other side of the conflict. That means if you're going to have diplomatic efforts within Libya, you have to bring all of these nations to this table to sit down and say we have to resolve this conflict. It means you have to take Russia, you have to take the UAE, and you have to take Turkey, all actors that do not agree on this conflict, and therefore you can't bring all of the actors to this table. But then the second attack on this is looking to our second contention. We talk about how you increase terrorism through doing diplomacy. The biggest problem here is that you have terrorist groups that are being backed by these nations. As the UK government points out, there remains a continuing high threat of kidnapping and criminal groups and armed groups and terrorist groups within Libya, such as Daesh, which is ISIS, and Al-Qaeda, which directly contribute to terrorist problems within the regions. If you are going to solve for the conflict within Syria, or within Libya, the direct problem here is that you have to tell these terrorist groups to step down and sit at a table with them. This means that they would be asking for the U.S. to, one, step in and give them whatever they want, but also it would mean these terrorist groups would be able to use these concessions and ceasefires as leverage, which inherently do not lead to benefits. Libya has to vote to the negation. Moving on to their Yemen argument, again, this is the biggest reason for why you have to vote in negation, because we are only fueling terrorism. According to The Guardian in 2022, they point out, so our opponents have tried to make this argument that the ceasefire has been beneficial in Yemen, but it has not. The Guardian in 2022 explains that again, many analysts said the benefits of a truce had been exaggerated by international organizations, where the Houthi rebels had refused to reopen roads needed to reach people most in need, where the truce should have improved humanitarian conditions, but in reality, it did not. They point out that every truce has been an opportunity to mobilize and recruit fighters. This is especially seen where we have seen an increase in deaths after these ceasefires, where Garmirian in 2022 points out that an uptick of violence in Yemen led to 38 children being killed or injured in the final weeks of a UN-brokered truce, and it was the highest number of children casualties after the ceasefire, meaning that they were only able to regroup. You have to be able to solve for the Yemen ceasefire, but again, you have two issues here. First, you help the terrorist groups because the Houthis will use these as leverage, which also is backed by The Guardian in 2022 pointing out that the negotiations did not lead to an agreement, but the Houthis used them as leverage to get other concessions. The Houthis are literally just using these ceasefire for their own benefit, and then they continue to regroup and rearm, only leading to the conflict being exacerbated. Going on to their second contention where they talk about drugs, their main argument here is we have to work with Iran in order to stop the drug problem within their country. This inherently has to flow to the negation. According to the Atlantic Council in 2020, they point out that Iran fuels wars in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. They're trying to make the argument that Iran is not fueling these groups and that the groups are taking money away from Iran. That's not what the status quo is. In reality, Iran is trying to use these groups to deter U.S. influence in the region. They do it in order to hurt Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and our allies, and therefore they're the ones that want the terrorist groups in the region because it helps the Iranian regime to stay in power. The problem is in the status quo, the U.S. current approach is working according to Nova News in 2022, saying that Iran is about to collapse because of U.S. sanctions. Doing diplomacy only removes these sanctions from Iran, and therefore the status quo is solving for all of the problems that Iran caused with the drug issues, and for Yemen and in Libya. All that we see is you have to not make diplomatic efforts with Iran. That should be the biggest issue in this round. Thank you.
tell me how diplomacy was the direct cause of increased terrorism?
Yeah, okay, so judges, it's not only one logical, but we saw it in Afghanistan. When the U.S. sits down with terrorist groups and tries to solve, and we also see it in Yemen, they use these concessions for leverage, where they ask the U.S. for things in return. So, like, the best example where we've seen it actually have massive impacts is Afghanistan, where we sat down with the Taliban, we told them to stop doing their human rights atrocities. Now they're in power now they have power within Afghanistan. They didn't actually say what they said they were going to do, which was decrease human rights violations, and it only led to more problems when the U.S. actually tried to make concessions.
So two things. Number one, Afghanistan is not in the West Asian region as we define our definition, but even if you don't believe that, Afghanistan was military intervention. This specific resolution deals with diplomatic intervention. Afghanistan was only military intervention. So as a follow-up, what was the specific diplomatic intervention we used? Was it the negotiations and that was the only one?
Yeah, well, that's the key problem
Okay,
of U.S.
go ahead.
diplomacy is you have to actually, if you're going to peacefully resolve internal conflicts, you have to sit down.
Right, but you,
and make
yes, I
peace
agree, it's
negotiations.
peacefully resolved, but you just described to me the negotiations paired with military conflict and U.S. involvement, which we had been in for 10
No,
years.
that's not what we're saying. We're saying after U.S. military involvement, the Taliban were in power, we asked them to stop their human
But
rights
it's still
atrocities,
military
and they did not.
involvement.
No, it's after the U.S.'s military involvement. After we left the region, the U.S. sat down with the Taliban, said you have to stop your human rights atrocities, and they said we'll give you power in the country, we'll do all of this. But then they went back, they reverted their human rights, and they have increased the problems within
But
the country.
Afghanistan's not in West Asia. Go ahead.
But it's still an example of terrorism where the
But
U.S.
it's
makes
not in
concessions
West
to
Asia.
terrorist
Go ahead.
groups. That's fine. Okay, so looking to your attack on our first contention, you said that diplomatic resources have increased. However, the State Department has had the lowest level of funding currently.
So let me,
with,
go ahead.
Sure, go ahead.
Let me clarify, I'm not saying diplomatic resources and the status quo have increased. I'm saying under this resolution, because you have increased diplomatic involvement, you also increase the number of diplomatic resources you have with the increased
Can I
diplomacy.
follow up really quickly?
Yeah.
So if the resolution is in the status quo, it means that after this round, if you were to vote in affirmation, you would have to have, this would mean that peace negotiations would have to happen. If the U.S. if the Department of State is already underfunded and you would have to do this right now, doesn't that mean that the Department of State wouldn't be able to do this in the status quo?
No, so the resolution says the U.S. government should implement increase U.S. diplomacy. That means the U.S. government, whenever you have a resolution passed in Congress or the U.S. government, you also have the funding and everything that comes around with it. So what we're saying specifically is when you increase U.S. diplomatic involvement, you also inherently increase the number of resources that diplomatic intervention has. So specifically on your point on China, can you talk to us, on Russia and Ukraine,
Yeah.
what are the impacts of shifting resources?
Yeah, okay. I'm going to go over time in answering that. Is that okay?
Yeah, as long as it's short.
Okay, yeah. So the problem here is you're trying to create peace in the Middle East, which is already a very lofty goal for the United States, where we've tried diplomacy, we've tried the military, and it takes massive amounts of resources to create peace. And so Russia and China is more important. It takes too many resources.
Sure.
Just a quick off-time roadmap. I'm going to be going through the framework of the affirmation, key points of clash, weighing the impacts, if I have time, strengthen my partner nice case. So are my judges ready? Opponents ready? And we're ready. Great. My time will begin now. All the AF ballot needs to do is prove that AF world is better than the status quo, aka the neg world. We are not saying that we have to have a stable government if we are instead saving lives. If we can prove that the world is better under an AF ballot, vote AF. Now going on to our first key point of clash, making things worse. So the opposition's first contention was detrimental trade-offs, and how they provide the example of Russia and the Ukrainian war. However, in Russia and Ukraine, we don't use diplomacy, we instead use militarization. That is not peaceful resolvement of internal armed conflicts. Therefore, we are not moving any of their resources. Additionally, Russia values hard power, and therefore, Applebaum 22 at the Atlanta reports that after violating the Budapest Memorandum, guaranteeing Ukrainian security, Russia only respects hard power, meaning diplomacy makes the U.S. look weak. Additionally, going on to their whole idea of the detrimental trade-offs, Larison 22 writes that the reason U.S. diplomacy is impaired is because of lack of resources. when you increase diplomacy, you increase the amount of diplomatic resources. Lack of resources is why this shift has occurred in the status quo. But if you have enough resources, you don't have a shift, so you can concentrate on both regions with an AF ballot with increased diplomacy. Now going on to our second key point of clash being solvency. We cannot rely on logic for examples of diplomacy being harmful. Affirmation provides multiple examples of how an AF ballot will provide solvency for internal armed conflicts. So starting with Afghanistan, my partner already provided the FAO definition that this is not a country in West Asia, therefore all impacts with Afghanistan are null. Now going on to Yemen, even if Houthis closed some roads and 38 children unfortunately died, we see so many more beneficial impacts from increased diplomacy and diplomacy in general in Yemen. So starting with the truce. Yes, this expired, but Johnson 22 reports that casualties across the country dropped 60% according to the UN during this truce. Additionally, Monday 23 writes that even after this truce expired, civilian casualties were not at the same level and were in fact decreased than before the truce. So even though this truce expired, we can see that from diplomacy, there are long-lasting impacts into the status quo, giving all the more reason as to why increased diplomacy will be more beneficial for peace. Now going on to the Houthi movements and Houthi control of some areas within Yemen. The recuperation of Houthi also allowed the official government to recuperate itself. Johnson 22 explains that the truce came at an opportunity time for the official government too, meaning the impacts for the Houthi government are equal and weigh out. Ultimately, we are going to be weighing both the AF and the negation. Under the affirmative, we provide direct solvency. First, we can see it with our Libya contingent mediation, Yemen, going on to drugs, we can see that we provide direct solvency of increased profiting for terrorist groups that create internal armed conflicts, and ultimately, under the negation, they have no direct examples. They provide examples of militarization, which that's great, but that is not peaceful resolution of internal armed conflicts. Militarization is violence, and diplomacy is peace. If they can't provide examples of diplomacy, not militarization, then there is no reason to have them vote AF. Judges, I'm going to take running about time. I'll start the time now. Judges, I use 1 minute and 18 seconds, so I'm just going to write that down on my board. Is anybody not writing that? Xander and I started off this round by saying we will earn your con ballot by proving that increased U.S. diplomacy in West Asia will have more harms than benefits. So let's look to one key issue of this debate first. Does the U.S. actually have the resources for more diplomacy? Our opponents try and give you this false idea that increasing our diplomatic efforts means increasing our diplomatic resources. First off, go back to the resolution. It says United States will increase its diplomatic efforts. It does not even mention resources anywhere. But this is a complete logical fallacy. The U.S. can't magically get more resources. That's not happening in the status quo. But also go to what Xander tells you in second-person cross-checks. Funding for U.S. diplomacy decreased in 2023. What we're seeing is we're actually taking away from our U.S. diplomatic resources. But also, regardless of that, even if you don't buy any of that, they still don't address our link that we give you in our case. The Middle East Institute of this year tells you that the U.S. already cannot balance its diplomacy and its military. So
we physically cannot increase our diplomatic efforts if we already can't balance what we have in the status quo. But going on to the main points that we tell you Ukraine. So our opponents give you this 2022 card saying the U.S. doesn't do diplomacy in the war. We tell you Bloomberg of this month from 4 days ago tells you that Ukraine will be ready for diplomatic talks with Russia soon, and the U.S. will need to focus its diplomatic efforts there. They tell you that U.S. involvement in those diplomatic efforts are key. But secondly, they tell you that the United States hasn't given Ukraine aid at all. That's completely false. Not only have we seen them give billions of dollars of aid to Ukraine, but look to what we tell you in our case. New York Times in 2023 explains that stockpiles in the U.S. are strained and American arms makers can't keep up, forcing the U.S. to pull from Israeli arms reserves in order to keep up Ukrainian support. We can't handle shifting our supplies and increasing even more to West Asia. We already can barely get through the status quo. But going into this point about the Indo-Pacific, what we tell you is right now in 2023, Brookings tells you, if anything, China's coming into 2023 likely to double down on its pressure in Taiwan. And we also see the Council on Foreign Relations of this year tells you President Biden has said the U.S. will defend Taiwan in the event of an attack, even though no treaty obligates it to do so. We're going to stay committed to Taiwan and our allies in the Indo-Pacific. We're seeing that China is being more aggressive than ever. We need to maintain our U.S. diplomatic efforts and our militaristic efforts there too. And not only that, go back to our link where we tell you multiple times, in order to create stability in West Asia, you have to solve for that Ukraine war, Russia-Ukraine war. We give you that Congressional Research Center card that literally tells you that working to first peacefully resolve the war in Ukraine is necessary to stabilize West Asia. They don't address this at all. But going on to our second contention, the pro-world AIDS terrorists, they tell you to outweigh pros benefits of saving civilians even if terrorism increases. Look to what we tell you. ISIS, the Kurds, Houthis, Hezbollah, there's so many terrorist groups in that region. We're going to increase terrorism by giving away any U.S. leverage that we currently had, and what we're seeing is that the status quo is working. We give you multiple cards, which we can read through to you later, but military efforts are working. We've even started a plan to 4-year militarily decrease ISIS, essentially, in the status quo. What we're seeing is the status quo is better. You cannot increase your diplomacy. You don't have the resources to do this, and we'll only see increases in terrorism, which is why you should vote. Thank you.
Litigation ready? Judges ready?
So, if we are using militarization in the status quo, why can we not increase diplomacy for increased resources?
For increased resources? Okay, so
Yeah.
So go back to our case. We give you that responsible statecraft from last year tells you that U.S. diplomatic institutions already lack resources, and failures in diplomacy lead to more military involvement. What we're seeing is diplomacy.
So why can we
and
not
military are
increase
connected.
diplomacy?
Because we don't have the diplomatic resources. We started off the year funding decreased for diplomacy, and also we see that when you're increasing diplomacy and it fails, you see more military involvement, so you're actually increasing both.
Okay,
We've
you
already
can have a
strained in
question.
both regions.
Okay. So you guys said that the Houthis in Yemen came back to the talking table. Is that not just like another example of how when like we see that there's problems in Yemen, the Houthis just want to go back and regroup and get weapons again and increase the conflict?
So first of all, we have this idea that only the Houthis recuperated. We also had the government forces recuperated. So when you weigh on impacts, you weigh them
I have a
equally.
follow-up
But even if,
question.
go ahead.
So if the government and the Houthis are both recouping their efforts and increasing their military, does that not just exacerbate fighting?
No, because we see in Yemen we had key negotiations continue and key agreements continue, like the free flow into Qudaiya port.
So-
We also had Sana'a Airport, which allowed 27,000
Ultimately-
people to get medical attention, and we also saw the reduction in conflict.
When we're taking the entire scope into question from this debate, we can see that there is the Houthi involvement, but that weighs out with our government involvement, and we provide the examples of the troops being providing solvency.
Question.
Yeah, so why exactly is the status quo better if we have a lack of resources?
Because the status quo, we currently manage our diplomatic resources in the Middle East perfectly, and then we're able to deter China and Russia in the
So
face
it's
where
better to
they-
have a lack of resources in the status quo than the potential benefits we bring up in our case.
Well, no, the lack of. Okay, so the problem with that is like the lack of resources is only because the United States hasn't ever increased its diplomatic resources through the Department of State, like especially in the status quo. We're only seeing it decreasing. The highest that it's been was in 2019. It's only been decreased since.
Right, we understand that the resolution says increased U.S. diplomatic involvement, and when we see that, we also see traditionally with resolutions that are passed for involvement in
Yeah.
whatever country, we see the adequate resources either through budgeting or whether through Congress, we see those resources being increased.
Yeah,
Do you have a
okay.
question?
Yeah, okay, just really quickly. If the Biden administration is going into Yemen and they're trying to increase diplomatic efforts in other countries, but at the same time we're seeing the Department of State decrease their funding, does that not just show you that like we don't increase funding when we increase our diplomatic
Currently,
efforts?
we're not increasing our diplomatic efforts. We're advocating that we should increase our diplomatic
And
efforts.
also
So you're
additionally,
doing a
we
plan.
may be decreasing our funding overall, but that doesn't mean we're decreasing our funding for foreign aid.
Sorry, I'm just going to do the math real quick.
1 minute, 30 seconds.
Perfect, thank you. Time starting now. Are judges ready? Opponents ready? Partner ready? Quick off-time roadmap. I'm going to go through 2 key voting issues and then just wait for the debate. And I'm going to start with the framework, sorry. Time starting now. Remember the framework. We affirm if we save lives, you vote aye. Now moving to the first key voting issue with the idea of making things worse. Their first example is shifting resources. We already tell you Larison 22 says the reason diplomacy is impaired is because of a lack of resources. But when you increase diplomacy, traditionally we've always seen an increase in diplomatic resources. Specifically, when you procure the idea of lack of resources, you also prevent the shift from happening because you can focus on both of them. But even if you don't believe this, they say we need to be involved in Russia and Ukraine, and that's a region we need to include ourselves. But they ignored our part in Applebaum 22 that says we don't use diplomacy in Russia and Ukraine. And second of all, we tell you that we don't want to get involved, and that's why we didn't send troops into Russia and Ukraine in the first place. But even if you don't believe this, they gave a card that the U.S. needs to help Ukraine and Russia to deal out their negotiations. But let me make a clear clarification. Just because we need to help Russia and Ukraine doesn't mean the U.S. will actually help Russia and Ukraine and divert their resources. There's no reason for a shift in policy. Their final example of making things worse is terrorism, and they gave example of Afghanistan, which we tell you again, according to our FAO definition, is in West Asia. And we also tell you in the status quo, any kind of efforts to combat terrorism are not working. Thrall 18 tell you that in the status quo it doesn't work, so we need to do something. Which is why, again, we advocate for diplomacy in the AF world. Now, moving on to our second key voting issue is the AF world, Libya. They said that we can't have stability in the AF world. Okay, we agree we cannot solve every other conflict or every conflict that comes across, but that's not what we're trying to prove. We are saving lives, and we tell you that the Williams 23, the Brookings Institute, held that violence decreased not only during the truce, but after the truce. And even if you don't believe this, Yemen, let's take a look at the same thing. They said that the Houthi forces will allow to recuperate, but they continue to ignore our evidence that said the government forces will allow to recuperate too. So when you weigh on impacts, you will weigh both of them out, and they both don't go through. Johnson 22 explains that the truce allowed for a reduction in conflict of 60%, and Lender King 22 says key negotiations continued even after the truce ended. Not only do you see short-term stability, you see long-term. For all these reasons, affirm.
I'm gonna take running, bro.
You only have 1 minute 40.
Start that time. address theirs and then we'll get to the voting issues. All right, time starts. Starting off with their voting issues, what they tried to say that they won on, which we already responded to after the entirety of this round. They said that increased diplomacy means an increase in resources. I just told you in the crossfire, we told you throughout the entirety of this round that the U.S. Department of State has been decreasing its diplomatic resources, and they even tell you that we've been trying to increase our diplomacy in Yemen. It's a clear contradiction. We haven't been increasing our diplomatic resources, and we tell you that we've been trying to increase our diplomacy. This clearly hasn't been happening. Then they try to tell you that U.S. diplomacy doesn't work in Ukraine, and it won't, and that we haven't been doing this. However, as we tell you in our case, which they don't respond to, we tell you the fact that the U.S. has to be in Ukraine in order to do diplomatic talks. They have no response to this. And going on to where they talk about terrorism, we already responded to this as well. They give you 2018 evidence saying that the status quo doesn't work. We told you in 2022 that the U.S. military has been directly deterring ISIS. They had no response to this either. We're clearly seeing that the military is working to deter these groups within this region, and they had no response to saying that terrorism is decreased. Also, inherently, you can't do diplomacy with terrorist groups. That directly goes to our second contention. Diplomacy doesn't work. You have to sit down with these terrorist groups, ask them to stop what they're doing, and in return, they do what the Houthis did within Yemen, where they only asked for more and they asked for concessions and they got power because of this. Going on to their third point, they talked about how the government can recruit during the ceasefire. Again, we told you that's the problem. They're literally advocating for ceasefires, which allow for wars to become exacerbated. They have to prove that you are actually solving for these conflicts. Therefore, all of the points that they tried to bring up in their final focus had already flowed to the negation, but also continue to flow to the negation. Now let's get into the two key voting issues that we went on. It's literally just our case. The first, we tell you we don't have enough resources to balance diplomacy and the military. Their only real response to this was saying that we've increased our diplomatic resources. Again, we already addressed this point. And then on top of the military as well, we told you at the top of our case that when you increase diplomacy, you also see military increase. They don't address this point either. All that you see is that diplomacy leads to an increase in military efforts. You can't create peace in the Middle East through diplomacy because it will draw on the U.S. military, taking it away from China and Russia. And then going on again to our second contention, we've turned their entire case to the negation. They try to appeal to your emotions, say you save lives, you only increase terrorism, and you don't have enough resources to combat the other two wars in the world. Therefore, I can only see a vote in negation.